Here's something that surprises most people. The loudness of your tinnitus doesn't necessarily determine how much it bothers you. In fact, I've seen patients with very loud tinnitus who have barely noticed it, and others with much quieter tinnitus whose lives have been turned upside down. So why does that happen? That's exactly what we're going to talk about today. Hi, I'm Megan Thomas, a doctor of audiology and owner of HearSense SC in Columbia, South Carolina. I work with patients every day who are dealing with tinnitus, hearing loss, and auditory processing disorder. Today, we're going to talk about why tinnitus bothers some people much more than others. In fact, two people can have very similar tinnitus, but one hardly notices it, while the other finds it overwhelming. Today, I'll explain why, and it all comes down to the way the brain processes sound. If you've ever talked to someone who has tinnitus, you've probably heard two very different stories. One person says, "Yeah, I've had ringing in my ears for years and I barely notice it anymore." Another person says, "It's all I can think about. It's affecting my sleep, my concentration, and my quality of life." So why the difference? Why can two people have tinnitus, but one is devastated by it while the other seems to barely be bothered? To understand that, we need to talk about two important systems in the brain: the classical auditory pathway and the non-classical auditory pathway. But before we get started, if you could do me a big favor and go ahead and hit the like button. And if you aren't already a subscriber to this channel, go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on notifications. It is greatly appreciated. Also, I'd love to hear from you about when your tinnitus is the most noticeable. Is it at night in a quiet room or when you're super stressed? You may find that other viewers have similar experiences, so please leave a comment below. Let's get started with the classical auditory pathway. This is the pathway most people think about when they think about hearing. This is the one that all audiologists learn about in graduate school. In this pathway, sound enters the ear, travels through the ear canal, vibrates the eardrum, moves through the middle ear bones, and eventually reaches the cochlea in the inner ear. Inside the cochlea are thousands of specialized sensory cells called hair cells. These cells convert sound into electrical signals that travel through the auditory nerve and up into the auditory cortex, which is part of the brain that's responsible for hearing. This entire route is called the classical auditory pathway. Its job is simple: detect sound and help us identify what we are hearing. This pathway only transmits sound. No other sensory information travels in this pathway. When hearing loss occurs, whether it's from aging, noise exposure, certain medications, or other causes, the brain receives less auditory input from the ear. And many researchers believe that in response to this reduced input, the brain essentially turns up the volume in the auditory system. The result can be abnormal neural activity, which we would then perceive as tinnitus. In other words, the classical auditory pathway helps explain why tinnitus occurs. But here's the problem. It doesn't explain why tinnitus bothers some people much more than others. If tinnitus were simply a hearing problem, then people with the loudest tinnitus should always be the most distressed. But that's not what we see. In fact, research has consistently shown that tinnitus loudness and tinnitus distress are often poorly correlated. Some people have loud tinnitus and function quite well, while others have relatively mild tinnitus but experience significant anxiety, depression, sleep disturbances, and difficulty concentrating. And that's where the non-classical auditory pathway comes in. The non-classical pathway involves connections between the auditory system and other regions in the brain that process emotions, attention, memory, and threat detection. So think of it this way. The classical pathway helps you hear sound, and the non-classical pathway helps you determine what that sound means to you. One of the key structures involved is the amygdala. The amygdala is part of the limbic system and it acts like an alarm center for the brain. Its job is to determine whether something is important or potentially life-threatening. When tinnitus first develops, many people become understandably concerned. Like, what is this sound? Is there something wrong with me? Is it going to get worse? Will I ever sleep again? If the brain begins associating tinnitus with danger, uncertainty, or fear, The amygdala can amplify the emotional response to the sound. Now, tinnitus isn't just a sound, it's a source of stress. Another important player is the hippocampus, which is involved in learning and memory. The hippocampus helps create associations between experiences and emotions. So if every time you notice your tinnitus, you become frustrated, anxious, or upset, the brain begins to strengthen those connections. And over time, tinnitus becomes linked with negative emotional experiences. The brain essentially learns that tinnitus deserves attention, and that's exactly what it gives it. The brain's attention networks also become involved. Normally, our brains are incredibly good at filtering out unimportant information. You probably aren't consciously aware of your refrigerator running, or you probably aren't paying attention to the feeling of your clothes touching your skin. Your brain filters those sensations out because they aren't important. But when tinnitus becomes associated with a threat or distress, the brain stops filtering it out. Instead, it continuously monitors it. The result is a frustrating cycle. You notice the tinnitus, you become concerned about it. The brain increases its attention towards it. The tinnitus becomes more noticeable, which increases concern, which increases attention, and the cycle continues. Researchers sometimes refer to this as a tinnitus distress network. It's one reason why stress, anxiety, fatigue, and poor sleep often make tinnitus seem worse. The actual tinnitus may not have changed much at all, but what has changed is how the brain is processing it. This understanding has dramatically changed how we approach tinnitus treatment. Years ago, most treatments focused primarily on the ear and the auditory system. Today, we know that successful tinnitus management often involves addressing both pathways. The auditory pathway may be addressed through hearing aids, sound therapy, and improving access to sound. The non-classical pathway may be addressed through counseling, cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness strategies, stress management, or bimodal neuromodulation, like the linear device. The goal isn't always to eliminate the tinnitus signal completely. The goal is often to reduce the importance the brain assigns to that signal. When the brain stops treating tinnitus like a threat, something remarkable can happen. The sound may still be present, but it no longer dominates attention. And this process is called habituation. Habituation doesn't mean giving up or learning to live miserably with tinnitus. It means the brain has learned that tinnitus is not dangerous, it's not important, and not worth constantly monitoring. Just like the hum of an air conditioner or the sound of distant traffic, it fades into the background of awareness. So when patients ask me why tinnitus bothers some people and not others, my answer is this. The classical auditory pathway may explain why you hear tinnitus, but the non-classical auditory pathway often explains why you suffer from tinnitus. Understanding both pathways helps us understand why tinnitus is much more than an ear condition. It is an interaction between hearing, attention, emotion, memory, and the brain's natural threat detection systems. And perhaps, most importantly, it helps explain why so many people can improve even when the sound itself doesn't completely disappear.